In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostra.
Co Iesus sacratissimum,
miserere nobis.
co Maria Immaculatum,
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Pie Decime.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, we continue with the study of the liturgical revolution, which definitely touches on doctrine. We left off on page 89 when Bonini's chickens came home to roost. How ironic that Father Antonelli, who had been given chief responsibility on Pius XII's commission for the reform of Holy Week, later deplored the outcome of what the commission initiated in the 1950s. In his memoirs, he noted, so this is not to suggest that Cardinal Antonelli wanted to preserve intact the Church's liturgical tradition. He was secretary for the Liturgical Commission of the Second Vatican Council, a member of the Post-Conciliar Concilium, and became secretary of the Sacred Congregation of Rites in 1965. So he's a moderate liberal. He didn't want to go all the way, but he saw that the bull got out of the corral. So take it, Michael. What's he say here?
Quote, many of those who have influenced the reform and others have no love and no veneration of that which has been handed down to us. They begin by despising everything that is actually there. This negative mentality is unjust and pernicious. With this mentality, they have only been able to demolish and not to restore, end quote.
Quite. But the metaphor of pots and kettles springs to mind. For Father Antonelli was himself in the forefront of the Liturgical Commission's work and did this share of wielding the demolition ball in the 1950s against the Holy Week rites. Yet, at that critical point in history when papal support for the protection of the traditional rites was essential, Pius XII was on the wrong side, aligning himself with those who aimed to demolish tradition. Again, why didn't Pius XII see this? Maybe he was blinded, partly because he didn't do what? He didn't do the consecration of Russia. It should have been him. It should have been him. Chapter 8, Easter Vigil, 1951, starting gun for the Holy Week reforms. Michael.
At the first German National Liturgical Congress in June 1950, organized by the Liturgical Institute of Trier, Father Romano Gardini gave a presentation on the Easter Vigil, which gave rise to the resolution that, quote, the bishops be asked to petition Rome for the transfer of the Holy Saturday celebration to the evening or night, end quote. This was followed up on the 2nd of November 1950, when the bishops of Germany, France, and Austria formally petitioned Pius XII to move the celebration of Holy Saturday to the evening. Their request was accepted, and an experimental vigil was inaugurated on the 9th of February 1951. With this concession from the Holy See, the liturgical movement was officially recognized as a change agent for the traditional Holy Week ceremonies. What was the rationale of the Holy Week reforms when, in the opinion of everyone else outside the liturgical movement, there was no obvious or compelling need for any change whatever? Bugnini later explained in his memoirs, quote, the liturgical movement was an effort to unite rites and content, for its aim was to restore as fully as possible the expressiveness and sanctifying power of the liturgy, and to bring the faithful back to full participation and understanding, end quote.
A circular argument, Anthony.
But this explains nothing except that the assumptions he started with determine the conclusions he came to. In other words, he already believed, like the Protestants, that the Catholic liturgy, as it had been handed down through the centuries, was essentially falsified and also dysfunctional. According to him, there was a mismatch between the ceremonies of the Roman Rite and the content which they were meant to represent. His quote-unquote solution, to adapt the liturgy in the direction of active participation so that people could understand it better, simply reinforced his preconceived ideas about a supposed, quote, ignorance and dark night of worship out in the nave, end quote. With this explanation, the cat was well and truly out of the bag. It was exactly the same rationalization put forward by the Commission, which had produced the decree Maxima Redemptionis in 1955. The main point of similarity between them was the undercurrent of hostility to tradition, discernible in both accounts, which is hardly surprising given that they were masterminded by the same set of reformers to the deliberate exclusion of traditionalist viewpoints.
Yes, so the hatred of tradition, that's a modernist hallmark, and it's still governing in Rome today. It's still the same spirit. A strange anomaly. Gabriel?
It is noteworthy that those who happily condemn such an explanation coming directly from Mugnini are prepared to brush it aside or overlook it when it emanates from a decree promulgated by Pius XII. That is because they have conferred upon Pius XII the iconic status of the quote-unquote last traditional pope, believing that he ensured the continuity of tradition. But the proof of continuity is fidelity to tradition, and Pius XII authorized substantial changes, including innovations in the Holy Week rites, all in the name of active participation. How could he have ensued continuity when he failed to make a full commitment to the liturgical tradition, which is its only guarantee? Whatever the decree of Pius XII's personal complicity in the reforms, it is unarguable. Yes. It is unarguable that an arbitrary restructuring of the Church's liturgy has always been alien to Orthodox Catholic instinct and practice. What possible justification could there be for changing the face of the Holy Week rites? When we examine the decree Maxima Redemptionis, we will see that its purpose was not to provide well-reasoned arguments for reform, but to convey an attitude. It positively bristled with loaded polemics that served to prejudice the faithful against their own traditions and to lock the liturgical movement into a negative attitude to the Church's spiritual patrimony. Let us look at the rationalizations that were considered by Pius XII's commission to be worthy of special consideration and emphasis.
So that's a very good point, isn't it? How could Pius XII ensure continuity when he failed to make a full commitment to the liturgical tradition, which is its only guarantee? So the proof of continuity is fidelity to tradition. But if you change the liturgical prayers in such a radical way, is that really fidelity to tradition? That's the question here. Tradition is subjected to criticism, disparagement, and even ridicule. Michael?
The most popular argument put forward by the reformers in favor of changing the Easter Vigil was the alleged illogicality of lighting the Easter fire and candle in daylight hours. How absurd, they scoffed, to be singing about the darkness of this night in broad daylight.
So the pre-55, right? The fire's in the day, in the morning. And then at the Exultet, you're singing about how beautiful this night is. So that's what they're saying, the modernists, you know. Why are you holding the Easter Vigil fire in the morning? This is absurd. You got to get rid of it. Go on.
As if the church had committed a liturgical gaffe that had gone unnoticed for 13 centuries. And so the reformers sneered and snickered at the age-old Easter Vigil, led on by the instigator of the liturgical movement, Dom Baudouin, who stated scathingly in 1951, quote, "How come that we have endured and accepted uncritically for centuries the practice of singing the Exultet and the Vere Beate Nox, O truly blessed night, in broad daylight?" He went on to add, quote, "And how many other equally serious anomalies we now accept without batting an eyelid. Surely this must lead us to conclude that our liturgical consciousness is not sufficiently enlightened," end quote. Baudouin's view was based on the assumption that all his predecessors in the priesthood were either oppressed by tyrannical church leaders or were too dim-witted to think for themselves, and furthermore, that there was only one way to think, his way. It was also a view that came to dominate and distort the thinking of theologians and liturgists up to our times. The radical theologian Father Herbert McCabe, OP, echoed both Baudouin and Maxima Redemptionis when he opined, quote, "Before the 1956 restoration, the vigil was a very ramshackle affair, and its meaning was badly obscured by the preposterous practice of celebrating it on Holy Saturday morning instead of at night," end quote.
Yes, so they're all bent out of shape over this tradition of the church, of the morning vigil. But think about it. There's, on Holy Thursday night is the Mass, right? And then the transfer to the Blessed Sacrament, to the altar of reserve, the stripping of the altar. Good Friday, there's no Mass, but there's the Mass of the pre-sanctified, where the Blessed Sacrament is escorted with majesty, singing the Vexilla Regis to Christ the King, in sensation, in black vestments, the funeral of our Lord. So, for how many of you was this your first Good Friday pre-55? So, did you notice a striking difference between the 62 ones?
Well, I've never seen the 64.
All right.
I was chanting a lot, so I wasn't super focused on what was going on. But I didn't. The only 62 that I really saw, the priest added a lot from the I think the pre-55. So not too much.
But you never saw. There was never insensation. Never insensation of the. And then the lifting of the consecrated host. That's Christ on the cross. He dies on the cross. The breaking of the host, and then the consuming of the sacred species, and then ablution, and it's done. It's really powerful reenactment of Good Friday. A benighted reform, but it was Baudouin and his fellow reformers, not the followers of tradition, who were the benighted ones. What's that mean, benighted? Benighted ones.
Is the opposite of enlightened?
Well, good guess. But benighted. Benighted is an adjective meaning overtaken by darkness, literal, or more commonly in a state of intellectual, moral, or social ignorance, unenlightenment. Synonyms are unenlightened, ignorant, uneducated, primitive, backward, unsophisticated. So a benighted reform would mean
basically a dark reform.
Archaic.
a dark, ignorant, darkened So Baudouin was, there he is, benighted. He was one of the benighted ones. The central fallacy in Baudouin's argument, which was enshrined in Maxima Redemptionis, who wrote that?
That was Pius the 12th.
Was the midnight or at least sundown, was that midnight or sundown was the proper time to hold the Easter Vigil. But there is no rational sense to be found in the notion that the Church should imitate the example of the early Christians who held the Easter Vigil at midnight. So, I did the Easter Vigil at midnight many, many years, which was just the 55. So yes, as I was saying, so Holy Thursday night you have Mass, Holy Good Friday you have the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified. And in the Pre-55 you have the ceremony beginning in the morning and ending with the Mass around noon. And it's a Mass of the Easter Vigil. And then Easter Sunday Mass. So you get a Mass. While in the 55 change, there is no Mass on Saturday. Nothing. There's no Easter Vigil Mass. It's completely dropped. You see? The Easter Vigil Mass happens to be Easter Day Mass after midnight. You follow the point?
Yes. It's basically treated as like Christmas midnight mass, correct?
Pretty much. But it's you lose the real Easter Vigil Mass, which was on Saturday. Anyway, but there is no rational sense to be found in the notion that the Church should imitate what the early Christians did. Strong evidence exists to show that their worship meetings generally took place during the hours of darkness, not out of principle, but out of caution, because they were living in an era of persecution. Having claimed to be following the superior path of enlightenment, Baudouin failed to see what was glaringly obvious to well-instructed Catholics, that the references to the night in the traditional Easter Vigil had a mystical rather than a naturalistic significance. Let us listen to the following explanation of this point given by a prelate who had never been indoctrinated at the liturgical movement's ideology. With reference to the Easter Vigil, Cardinal Wiseman, who lived from 1802 to 1865, the first Archbishop of Westminster in England, stated that the service, quote, "The service speaks of the night. It is the night in which Israel escaped from Egypt, and which preceded the resurrection of Christ." As a metaphor for the darkness of the world in the bondage of sin before the redemption. It has no intrinsic connection with the time when the sun sinks below the horizon. An incoherent reform, Michael.
So the time of day when the vigil takes place is irrelevant. As far as the celebration of the mysteries of salvation is concerned, it matters not a jot if the sky is dark or light. The point is not a trivial one. It follows that holding the Easter Vigil in daylight hours could not, as Maxima Redemptionis contended, be, quote, detrimental to the liturgy's meaning, end quote, or contribute to any loss of its innate clarity. The irrationality of this claim becomes even more obvious when it is made the basis of legislation, as if the 1955 reforms were founded on solid and irrefutable arguments for the good of the Church. With Maxima Redemptionis, the bishops of the world were told that they would be breaking the law if they continued the traditions of their predecessors. Even today, to celebrate the Easter Vigil in daylight is regarded as reprehensible. And although there is no rational reason to insist on a nocturnal celebration of the Vigil, those who favor the traditional practice are themselves regulated to outer darkness. The essence of the problem with the Easter Vigil reform is that it was built on a series of fantasies. The first one being the inappropriateness of lighting the Easter fire and candle because the sun is shining. Alas, this was no joke. The framers of Maxima Redemptionis were perfectly serious in stipulating that the vigil must be held in the dark on pain of losing its innate clarity and even its sanctifying power. This idea was the brainchild of the liturgical movement. We will examine what the maverick liturgist Pius Parse had to say on the subject. Let us keep in mind that he had been celebrating the Easter Vigil at midnight since 1936, contrary to the universal practice of the Roman Rite, and was overjoyed that Pius XII had put the official seal of approval on his dissident behavior. Quote, "It is a restoration that is in part due to our efforts. It is one of the great objectives of the liturgical movement to restore the Catholic world. The Easter Vigil tells us. The unliturgical spirit and mentality of the last centuries has deprived us of the holiest of all nights. The liturgical spirit of our day will correct this error," end quote.
Wow, so all our ancestors had it wrong, and they're living in the dark, and now we're the enlightened ones. Go on.
There could hardly have been a clearer description of two positions developing alongside each other in the church. On the one hand, the bimillennial liturgy of the Catholic Church, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and on the other hand, a rapidly increasing parallel universe of very recent origin, populated by the members of the liturgical movement in self-declared opposition.
The aggressive implementation of the reforms, Anthony.
It is obvious that by 1955, the liturgical movement had overreached itself in trying to upstage the Holy Ghost, and as a result of its hubris, had turned itself into an ideology, and a coercive one at that. Maxima Redemptionis resulted in enforced compliance by bishops who were trying to hold the traditional line, and a victory for Bugnini and his liturgical commission. The injustice lies in the fact that here was a commission with a highly radical and ideological concept of its role in the church, pressuring Pius XII to make rulings which would be inimical to the interests and values of Catholic tradition.
Go on.
Creative pretexts for change. The other justifications for the Easter Vigil reform are hardly any more credible and deserve an equal amount of skepticism. Maxima Redemptionis tells us that attendance at all the Holy Week rites had been decreasing since the Middle Ages, quote, especially because their celebration had long since been put back into the morning hours when, on weekdays, schools, businesses, and public affairs of all kinds were and are conducted everywhere, end quote. It goes on to assert, quote, in fact, common and almost universal experience teaches that these liturgical services of the Sacred Triduum are often performed by the clergy with the body of the church nearly deserted, end quote. These claims are specious in the extreme and do not stand up to scrutiny. We will deal with each of them in turn. They were based on an interpretation of reports sent to the Holy See by the world's bishops and heads of religious congregations in response to an international survey, the purpose of which was to garner opinion on the 1951 experimental Easter Vigil reforms.
The selectivity bias in the interpretation of the results. Gabriel?
The first step in approaching the survey is to understand how the situation had been manipulated. According to Maxima Redemptionis, enthusiasm was reflected worldwide. Quote, this experiment had a greater success everywhere, as very many ordinaries have reported to the Holy See.
What's an ordinary?
Bishop.
Yes, the bishops. Go on.
End quote. But by then, the liturgical movement has succeeded in spreading its influence in various places throughout the Catholic world. with the result that there were some bishops in almost every country who welcomed a break with tradition. This is a very different situation from a quote-unquote worldwide consensus. The reformers ignored this distinction and read too much into the data by interpreting random variation as representative of the general opinion among the bishops. The pro-reform bishops were reported to have, quote, generously praised the restored rite, told of the spiritual fruits derived from it, and asked that the permission to celebrate it be further extended, end quote. Well, they would, of course, considering that they had been putting pressure on Pius XII for precisely those reforms. We can infer that the predicted outcome of the survey was a certainty for the reformers who had the Pope's ear. If further confirmation of this self-fulfilling prophecy is needed, the archives of the Diocese of Brentwood in the UK for 1951 record the responses of those priests who had elected to celebrate the new vigil. All were in favor of the changes, and some were wildly enthusiastic in their praise. But the fact that they had voluntarily taken this step suggests they had progressivist tendencies from the start, and were predisposed in favor of the new vigil. Their comments reveal that they had hobby horses of their own, and were already committed to the simplified rites in the vernacular and facing the people. Thus, the international survey gave liturgical cranks, dissidents, and radicals everywhere the opportunity to indulge their favorite pastime with permission from the Holy See. From this, we can deduce that the only liturgical forms permissible would be those that the Commission judged suitable to contribute to the store of active participation of the laity. But even more unethical was the cynical use of the unsuspecting faithful. They were the guinea pigs for the full-blown Holy Week changes that would be foisted on them a few years down the line. But what about those bishops who sent in negative reports, or who protested vehemently, or those who declined to comment? No indication was given as to their number, which we know must have been considerable from the available evidence. In some countries, the experimental vigil was not adopted by the majority. For example, in the US, where it was very much the exception. The progressivist journal, Worship, successor to Orate Fratres, and mouthpiece to the US liturgical movement, registered its disappointment at the lack of enthusiasm for the experimental vigil among most bishops. However, the tradition-minded bishops were accorded no recognition or consideration. Their views were
trivialized
and dismissed with a wave of the hand. The Congregation of Rites issued a document in January 1952, admitting that several bishops reported vague, quote-unquote, difficulties and doubts from parish priests about the experimental vigil, but went on to say that, quote, the Holy See would, by appropriate ordinances, settle the difficulties and resolve the doubts, end quote. But the bishops and priests who still continued to object were ignored. They had become the equivalent of Orwell's unpersons, found guilty of the thought crime of opposing the Bugnini Project.
Okay, footnote. In George Orwell's 1984, an unperson is someone who has been vaporized. It commonly refers to a public figure, especially in a totalitarian country, who for political or ideological reasons is not recognized or mentioned in government publications or records or in the news media. So we're used to that. Traditional Catholics are unpersons in the world's eyes. Go on.
As far as Maxima Redemptionis was concerned, it was as if they did not exist. And ever since then, they have been denied a voice in the church. Their marginalization being used to create a false consensus.
Yes. Pius XII sided with the commission against the traditional bishops. Pius XII ordered that the same commission of liturgists who had prepared the rite of the 1951 vigil should analyze the reports. Quote, January 11th, 1952, Our Most Holy Lord Pope Pius XII ordered that the same special commission of experts who had prepared the rite of the Paschal Vigil should carefully examine the aforementioned reports. And he would, as a matter of course, follow their recommendations. As there was no independent review of their work or any attempt at objectivity, the outcome was predetermined in favor of the commission members who performed their task in the predictably biased manner which we have seen above. Bonini declared the new rite an instant success and described its reception as, quote, an explosion of joy throughout the church. The general principle of the survey seemed to be that the conclusion came first and the data were cherry-picked to support and explain the desired result. That is, the world bishops were in favor of the renewed Easter Vigil. This process, more commonly known as spin, or skewing the facts, to fit a prejudice, raises the gravest possible doubts about the integrity of the Commission's work. It was obvious from the moment of Bonini's appointment as Secretary of the Commission, if not before, that nothing or no one, not even the Pope, must get in the way of the projected reforms. That is why Bonini relied on bias, official manipulation of the statistics, and suppression of inconvenient facts. By counting the hits and ignoring the misses, so to speak, Bonini and his henchmen arrived at conclusions that were not fully supported by the data. The result was a partial, oversimplistic, and highly fanciful picture of the general opinion amongst the world's bishops on the Easter Vigil ceremonies. Yet it was this self-serving interpretation which acted as a starting gun for the Holy Week reforms which would be imposed on the Church in 1955. A Potemkin facade. Anthony?
But why was there no external or independent evaluation to ensure an objective scrutiny of the results? Why was Monsignor Gromier, for instance, not consulted? Pius XII could hardly have expected the Commission to act as a dispassionate evaluator of the evidence when he knew that the people running the survey had an obvious interest in a favorable outcome for the liturgical movement. This institutionalized conflict of interest should be called by its proper name, fraud. The evidence so far indicates that this was a survey forged in a crucible of secrecy and deception. Like all pumpkin facades, it was designed solely to deceive others with an elaborate and impressive result, and thus impress the credulous. In this case, the survey was an attempt to beguile the reigning pontiff into believing that all was well in the domain of the liturgical reform. Spinning a false narrative. Maxima Redemptionis told us that attendance at all the Holy Week rites had been decreasing since the Middle Ages, to the point where, by the 20th century, quote, common and almost universal experience teaches that these liturgical services of the Sacred Triduum are often performed by the clergy, with the body of the church nearly deserted, end quote. It placed the blame for this alleged state of affairs on the church's scheduling of these services to the morning hours, quote, when on weekdays, schools, businesses, and public affairs of all kinds were and are conducted everywhere, end quote. It is difficult to know where to start to evaluate the accuracy of these broad and sweeping generalizations, encompassing not just centuries, but the dizzying complexity of the myriad parishes all over the world. The salient feature of the Liturgical Commission's survey was its intentional lack of perspective. No allusion is made to the many historical variables that may have affected the levels of attendance at the Holy Week services since the Middle Ages, such as the effects of the Reformation, the French and Russian revolutions, the 2 world wars, and the persecution of Catholics in various centuries around the world. Whilst there are bound to be churches where the Easter Vigil was not well attended, this may have been due to any number of causes. For instance, difficulty of access in remote areas, shortage of clergy, absence of apostolic zeal, or even the effects of the liturgical movement itself. We are entitled, therefore, to ask, what percentage of the alleged diminution in attendance was due to the morning celebration of the Easter Vigil? The fact that other contributory factors were intentionally ignored means that the argument rests on shaky grounds.
Okay, I'll stop there. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.